I know that this is the very best part, but you know we got to do the other business too. As usual, you know, Dennis is herding us around. Thank you, Dennis.
I don't know, the pictures that they were running were a lot of fun, except I haven't gotten a chance to see them, so I hope I get another cycle out there so I can watch the candid historical pictures. So if we could get everybody back at their seats, we will get started. We've got a very full schedule this hour. Okay. I want to welcome you to this next session, which is the session titled NSFNET, the Solicitation, the Marriott Partnership, which we discuss the T1 backbone solicitation from an executive level. The technical aspects of the NSFNET backbone will be discussed in later sessions, but we have today on this panel executives who were part of the partnership and represented that innovation. I started in the program director position at NSF just as these proposals came in, and my first task really was to get through this proposal awarded, and in the life of an NSF program officer, this is a big proposal. I didn't realize how big until later. If you're used to turning out $50,000 to $100,000 research grants, this is a different magnitude. But we reached this stage in the history on the shoulders of the people that you have heard earlier today. We wouldn't have gotten to this stage had they not done all the work for this. But this is the part where we have the issuance of the solicitation, which was done in June of 1987. There are people here who probably didn't get a lot of sleep between June and August when the proposals were due at the foundation. And then we had an award in November. Selection was reviewed in late August, and the selection was announced in November. That is a pretty fast track. I also later learned that that was very unusual, but that's what happened. And we have here the partnership, this partnership. And as people have said earlier, there are many, many partnerships. This whole enterprise was a partnership. But for this particular project, we have a partnership that represents the aspects that NSF used to talk about, and it was one of those ideals that we would have the federal government, we would have the university community, we would have corporate partners, we would have state partners, and in this partnership, we had all of those, and it was successful. And while working with this group, I have to say there were never sort of doubtful moments. We might have had our challenges, but they were not doubtful moments about the success. So I want to welcome the panelists here and introduce them briefly, and then we will start. We're really going to do this as a panel, where I will be asking them questions. The first person here is John Armstrong. John was the Director of Research at IBM. Those IBM research, that was a key, he played a key role in the executive oversight of this project within IBM, and he also later has served on the National Science Board, but he will bring that perspective of the decision to do this within IBM and the roles the role that IBM Research played in that. And next to him is Governor James Blanchard, who was the governor of Michigan at that time. Now, the state of Michigan participated through the Michigan Strategic Fund, which was something that Governor Blanchard helped establish, and he was key in getting that funding. I must say that Governor Blanchard did not attend our biweekly or quarterly meetings, but he was ably represented by Jamie Kenworthy, who is also here from the Michigan Strategic Fund. So it's a pleasure to have Governor Blanchard himself here today. And he has gone on to do a number of other things, including serving as ambassador, but we think of him here as the governor of Michigan, who made the state of Michigan participation possible. Robert Mazza, see next to him is at IBM. Was at IBM in the, what some of us will remember as the ACES group, in charge of the university partnerships and working with the university community and development projects, and had oversight for this project at IBM. Next to him is Douglas Van Houweling, who was at the time the technology vice president at the University of Michigan and president of the Marriott board. He was clearly the key person in putting together a partnership to respond to it. There might have been moments when he thought maybe that wasn't the wisest thing to have done, but I think in general he has to get lots of credit for being brave enough to have put this together and carried through with it to the end. Next to him is Stephen Wolff. All of you probably know Steve, as he was the second NSFNET program officer and the first division director for the NSF Division of Networking and Communications Research and Infrastructure. A long time since I had to get those words all out, but and was my boss at NSF, and is very important to this whole enterprise. And next to Steve is Ann Obie. Ann was not in this project at the beginning. She came to MCI in 1989 after the project was underway, and she was hired by MCI to oversee this project. And because she wasn't there at the beginning, she was with another telecommunications company prior to coming to MCI. But she will also share with us some insights from Richard Liebhaber, who was vice president, who, as I understand, was the one to get the first call to MCI about the possibility of participating, and the decision of MCI to do that. So I welcome these people, and we have this rare opportunity to have them here to look back and also to give us some insight into what made this a success and what we might learn about partnerships for the future, or anything else they think we might learn for the future. So I will start with a question to Steve Wolff and about the solicitation. The solicitation was issued in June of '87 for the provision of the National Backbone Network, and I would like him to reflect on what the aspects of that document that's helped shape the success of the project, or even shortcomings, if he felt there were some.
Thank you, Jane. Well, I think the first element of that solicitation was we dropped the other shoe with respect to the supercomputer centers. This was no longer a network to interconnect supercomputer centers, but also to include the vigorous and vigorously growing regional networks, which NSF had funded. And so the solicitation, rather than merely calling for an interconnection of 5 nodes, suddenly burgeoned to 13 nodes, and in later years it grew to 14 at T1 speeds. The shortcomings of the original NSFNET backbone were by this time, in June of '87, well understood throughout the community. It was very popular. It was so popular that nobody could use it. It was clear we needed faster speeds, and T1 was the next logical speed. So the principal technical requirement of the solicitation was going to T1 speeds. There were a number of other technical issues that we knew needed to be addressed, and we had not the expertise within the foundation to specify them. We were fortunate enough to get on loan at that time from some commercial organization somewhere, Steve Goldstein, who came in and was the principal author of the solicitation and included most of the technical requirements within the solicitation. And I don't know whether this is widely known, but we owe Steve a debt of gratitude because of the specifications which he wrote and which resulted in the successful backbone. The third aspect of the solicitation was that it was a cooperative agreement. Most of the people in this room have experience with NSF, and I don't have to elaborate on what a cooperative agreement is. But it is a very special kind of funding arrangement that provides for money to be given over a period of time to the awardee, but in addition provides for NSF to have its fingers in that project from beginning to end, whenever it feels like it. And in the end, this turned out to be one of the strengths of the project, that there was continuous and vigorous discussion between NSF and the awardee. Jane remarked on the rather compressed time scale. Well, this was, of course, necessary because the backbone was, the 56 kilobit backbone was falling over, and so the time scale from solicitation in June to arrival of proposals in August and the announcement of an award in November was pretty much unprecedented and occasioned a lot of hard work, mostly on Jane's part. Thanks.
Next, I would like to ask Doug Van Houweling to talk about the gathering, the decision to submit a proposal and on behalf of Marriott and gathering a group of partners to do that.
Sure, thank you, Jane. So this activity at Marriott and in Michigan had also had its origins in the supercomputing activity because I had moved from Carnegie Mellon University to the University of Michigan in similar roles at both universities at precisely the time the supercomputing competition was underway. And both institutions were competing for supercomputing centers. And when I got to the University of Michigan, it was my understanding from the leadership at the university that my job was to do everything that I could reasonably and legally do to improve the state of the university's leadership with regard to information technology activities in the higher education and research community. I was extremely fortunate that already in the state of Michigan was an organization that actually had been founded with NSF funding initially, along with state funding called Marriott, which had developed capabilities to do networking. And when the University of Michigan's proposal for a supercomputer was unsuccessful, I wound up having a visit with Eric Bloch, the then director of the foundation, to commiserate about how disappointed I was. And we wound up talking about networking because, of course, Eric had, because I think of the conversations that had already taken place at the foundation, Eric had this notion that the big opportunity here was going to be tying all these supercomputing centers together. And after all, the University of Michigan and the state of Michigan would be better served if it turned out that we were providing the networking that tied it all together. It was actually that led to the impetus for actually doing the proposal. We were also very fortunate that we had developed a very good relationship with IBM at the University of Michigan in the previous years. So my natural inclination, when I discovered from Jim Duderstadt, who was then on the National Science Board, that this network was only going to be funded at the level of $15 million, and I knew perfectly well that there was no hope for $15 million doing this job, I reached out to my traditional strong partner, IBM, in the person of Al Weiss, who's sitting here in the room and who you'll hear from later on. And Al then was in charge of computing at IBM Research, if I recall correctly, and then the rest of it happened. And you'll hear more about it as the panel goes along, but it was IBM then that brought MCI in and put the partnership together. There was, I'll say one more thing, Jane, and then we'll let the rest of this get worked out. There were periods in trying to put this partnership together where there was a high level of dubiousness on everybody's part about whether or not this was a sensible thing to do, whether or not we could trust one another as partners, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, we persevered, and once the partnership was together, it was a very solid partnership.
Thank you, Doug. And now I'd like to turn to John Armstrong to ask him about his IBM decision to participate in this.
Okay, thank you. Well, Jane's question, what was the key for your organization in deciding to participate in the backbone development? And the first thing I have to say is that IBM is and was a large, complex company, and very few decisions are made by IBM. This one was made, as you've already heard, it was made by the parts of IBM which were most connected to. The research division was part of these research networks. Part of our job within IBM was to be aware of important research going on in the world outside IBM and try to understand and bring that to bear where we could. And there was another part of IBM that you'll hear from when Bob Mazza talks that also was closely connected to the outside world. But it was that's where the decision was made. And of course we informed our superiors in the organization, and we had their blessing. But it was an initiative that was taken by IBM Research and by ACES, and I've got to echo something that my classmate Ken Wilson said earlier about how he had behaved. I don't remember Al Weiss coming to me and banging his shoe on the table, but my background was in physics, not in networking, and but it was clear to me that this was an important thing. It was an excitement in the computer science community, and we never had any doubt about whether we wanted to participate in it. How are we doing for time? I will say further that, if you, as a research organization in a large company, ideally, you work on what is already important to the company, trying to make it better, but also you have to be aware of what's going on in the much larger world of research as a whole. And that was part of IBM Research's job. And the best way to understand new and exciting developments is to participate. And that was another reason why we undertook to do it. Finally, I'll say that although we had the blessing of the very top management in IBM, I think it's probably fair to say that they had no idea how disruptive this all would be. But then, I think it's also fair to say that, as someone has already said today, very few of us in this room in 1987 really understood what we were doing. So that's the end of that.
Thanks, John. I think, next I'd like to turn to Ann Obie and to share with us how MCI became to be part of this.
Sure. Thank you, Jane. Dick Liebhaber recently described this as the great adventure when asked about the background leading up to MCI's participation. Dick served as the Chief Technology Officer at MCI and actually had retired from IBM prior to that, so he had relationships within IBM, and which led up to him getting the call. Prior to MCI's engagement in 1987, MCI was seen as rather a scrappy competitor in voice services. MCI Mail had emerged and as a successful packet service, but wasn't finding its way to broader networks. And MCI had responded to a voice and data bid to a major automotive and had been cited as having a superior response to that bid, but unfortunately did not have the current implementation to point to as a reference and was unsuccessful in the award. And Dick was quite convinced at that time that that would not happen again. So that was the landscape at MCI, at which time, and set the stage for getting the call, which he'd received from John Armstrong and Al Weiss as his former IBM colleagues, and Doug Van Houweling, whom Dick had had some experience with also during Doug's days at Carnegie Mellon. So at that point, Dick got on a flight and flew to Kingston, and as he said, sat around the campfire, and I was told 15 minutes later, MCI was in. Dick still had to go back and advise MCI. So he essentially went back to the ranch to sell it internally, and it wasn't quite the serene campfire scene, but more perhaps a little bit like the shootout at the OK Corral. But at an executive and customer seminar, there was a side executive meeting during which time Bill McGowan, Bert Roberts, and some head finance and sales individuals were part of this meeting, as was Dick. And the sales folks thought it was irrational. The finance folks thought it was more a little bit like cattle rustling or something in this scenario. So with that said, Dick went forward and presented the vision, which was embraced by Bill McGowan, and with his support went forward. And from then on, the rest was history. Dick decided that the way to make it work was to price it out 5 years into the future, which amounted to about an 80% discount. Dick said at that point he would have given it away, but he would have gone to jail. So I think you see that over the years, MCI's commitment has been strong and goes back to very deep roots.
At this point, I'd like to turn to Governor Blanchard because, unfortunately, he has a plane to catch. He will be back tomorrow, but I'm going to let him speak about the state of Michigan becoming involved in this.
Yeah, thank you, Jane, and thank you for your leadership and whatever role you had in making sure we got the award back in the fall of 1987. I'm sorry about leaving. You've seen plenty of politicians get up and leave. I'm no longer a politician. I'm a statesman, which means I've been out of office for some time. I really, seriously, going back to be with our Senator Carl Levin. And so how many of you are from Michigan, by the way? Raise your hands. Ah, look at that. And how many of you have lived in Michigan but aren't there now? All right, we want you back. All right. You know, our role in NSFNET was actually very simple. Of course, it couldn't have happened without Jamie Kenworthy, who is here, and you'll hear from him tomorrow, who worked with our Michigan Strategic Fund, and I actually knew Jamie, and he actually did give me reports on what was going on. And it couldn't have happened without Doug Van Houweling and his leadership, which has been fabulous, and Marriott. Marriott existed before I was governor, but to give you the scene here, I became governor in January of 1983, having served in Congress for 8 years. Michigan had 17% unemployment. We were looking for every kind of way to figure out how to diversify our economy. and use our strengths. And obviously, our great university system, our public university system, was one of those. And we're doing everything we could to encourage public-private partnerships and partnerships between the private sector, government, academia, and from time to time, labor as well. And so in that manner, we were doing a lot of things, increasing funding for universities, creating a research and excellence fund. One of the things I created was the Michigan Strategic Fund, which was designed to try to make selective investments in different kinds of projects that might hold promise off into the future, with the whole theory being, if you plant enough seeds, a couple of them will grow with fruition. I learned about NSFNET from actually Gary Bahula, who's currently your vice chairman, or vice president for government relations for Internet 2. Gary had worked for my former colleague, Bob Traxler, a congressman who oversaw the National Science Foundation budget as chairman of the Appropriations Committee here. Bob was very upset that Michigan didn't get that early grant, Doug. And he raised holy hell with Eric Block, who was wise enough to say, oh, don't worry, Bob, there's something else coming down the pike which will be a lot bigger. Maybe you ought to apply for that. So Gary came to me with the idea. It turns out Jamie Kenworthy was, I think, already working with Marriott as part of my strategic fund on this whole project. And so when it all came together with the wonderful participation of MCI and IBM, the University of Michigan, Marriott, and all the other universities, Michigan State, Wayne State, to me it was a no-brainer. I mean, it was explained to me this way. We're going to tie together all these computer systems and research institutions, 140 of them nationwide, so they can share information. And the way I thought about it was, that means somebody up in Marquette, Michigan, or Copper Harbor, Michigan, way up top, can someday get on a computer and access information in California or Australia or Ann Arbor, and they could be in the center of the world. I figured it was the start of something big if it worked, and we ought to try it. That's why we did the grant of $5 million. And at the announcement at Wayne State University in, I think, November of '87, only a few reporters showed up. But we were all really excited. I mean, obviously I had no idea what it would lead to, but I did think it was something big, and we needed it. Michigan needed it. We're proud of it. We're proud of the role. The lessons learned really are, because as you mentioned, I'm running for a plane, is you do have to plant seeds. Secondly, you have to have cooperation. And that's a lot harder among the political community, and I think many of you can speak for the academic community, a lot harder than it sounds. People worry so much about who's going to take credit and whether the benefits will occur during their little short term. Because the truth is, these benefits occurred after I left office. The government has to play a role in research and development and technology. You all know that, but there's still a lot of people in this country who think the government has no business funding it unless they're a defense contractor or a space contractor. And they forget about the role. And the story needs to be told. I'm so glad you're having this conference, so the story can be told to others and among each other. It needs to be told. This very day, I could summon the economic and business writers in Detroit, and they will not really understand what Doug and his people and Jamie and all of you created. So we've got to keep this ball rolling. We've got to find ways to tell the story and have this be a role model for so many other projects our country and our world desperately needs. I thank you, all of you, for your role in making it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Blanchard. And then I next like to turn to Bob Mazza and let him talk about his part of IBM, where this project landed, I think, in the world between corporate and university partnerships.
Yeah, well, it is appropriate, Jane, that you say our part of IBM, because as John pointed out, IBM is not a monolith, and within the company there are very deep-rooted interests in networking that were contrary to the directions that were being thought about for NSFNET. We, however, were part of an organization called Academic Computing. Academic Computing Academic Computing Information Systems, right? Academic Information Systems, right? ACIS, and had several studies. We had a very big budget to do studies with universities, and we did campus studies, campus networking studies, internetworking studies. We were actually with our senior management and said, why do you guys really want to do this? And it really had to do with our developing capability in these open systems, TCP/IP and networking. And then there are real reasons. And the more I thought about it, I think the real reason is we had teams in place who were engaged in aspects of this networking, and those teams fundamentally knew that they had to do it. And it was really the commitment, and as you know, as a director of that organization, when you have a team that's so committed to want to participate, and that it's actually very, very important that we find ways to make that happen, because that's fundamentally the key to success. So in reality, our goal ultimately was, I think at the time we said, it was called the National Data Highway, or at least was referred to as that. And was one WAG said at that time said is, what we don't want to be is roadkill on the National Data Highway.
Well, with that line, I will go to my next question, which is to ask what the biggest challenge, now that the solicitation the grant was awarded to Marriott and Michigan and its partners, what were the biggest challenges that were faced in the partnership? And I would like to start that with Doug Van Houweling from his perspective.
I'm going to take a little side course here first. So it's interesting that you're going to be with Senator Levin later today. I believe Senator Levin was watching us here from Ann Arbor earlier this morning. So when you see him, you need to ask him whether he visited our conference here this morning. He was visiting the Information Technology Center in Ann Arbor this morning, and we had set up, there is a remote viewing of this conference there. And so you can tell us when you come back tomorrow. At any rate, it's interesting, you know, when we started this, we didn't think that, although there was some vision of this, I remember you saying it, that these internet protocols would become the common bearer service for all of these different types of content. And of course, we're seeing that here today as we're being delivered to the rest of the world over the internet. But back to your question very quickly, I think there were two major challenges. The biggest technical challenge, by far, was the transition from T1 to T3. We knew it was going to be a big challenge because, and that brings me to the second, we understood that we had to change the organizational structure of the partnership in order to accommodate that challenge. And so we created a new not-for-profit called Advanced Network and Services in order to enable us to respond to that challenge. And I don't know how many people today would have thought that it would have been possible to get IBM and MCI and Northern Telecom all to donate millions of dollars to establish a new not-for-profit the purpose of which was to enable us to go from T1 to T3 and meet the rising tide on the internet backbone. But it was really quite an extraordinary challenge, and it was, I thought, extraordinary of these corporations. They had the vision to provide that support.
Next, I turn to John Armstrong to address that.
Okay, the question is, what were the biggest challenges? In particular, were there special challenges or benefits to this being a four-way partnership? As far as the biggest technical challenge, we certainly would agree with Doug's assessment that the upgrading to T3 was the biggest challenge, and it was a challenge in the sense that because it was harder than, let's put it this way, it was harder than there was money for. So it's always a challenge in organizations to find money that you hadn't planned on, and but that was an internal challenge, and it just went with the commitment that we had to do the job. I should also say, and I don't know about the case in MCI, but in IBM, although there was sort of blessing from the top, there was no extra money. You know, the research division and ACES had to fund our participation out of our own resources. But, you know, that's the sort of challenge that management is supposed to be able to deal with. My own view is, and it relates to this business of partnerships and leverage, for every dollar that the Science Foundation put into the cooperative agreement, IBM put in anywhere from 1 to 2. I don't think we ever made a complete accounting. There would have been no political purpose served in making an exact accounting. But anyway, it was, you know, that was a challenge. But well, I'll say one other thing as to what were the benefits. One of the very thoughtful things about the solicitation, or about the way that the partnership was structured, is that there were very clearly defined roles for each partner. You know, we didn't have to worry at IBM about, you know, getting data streams through the MCI switches, and, you know, they didn't have to worry about the technical details of the router, and neither of us had to worry about the routing tables and all of that. So the fact that the partners had very well-defined, separate, non-overlapping jobs was important. It was also important, and this goes with the general technical excitement that everybody's described, is there was no way we could succeed individually unless we all succeeded. There's no way that, you know, IBM could say, look, we've got this wonderful router, it's too bad the data streams don't go through your switches, or vice versa, you know. So it was structured in the way that I think often infrastructure projects need to be structured. It's somewhat different from the way most of the multi-institutional collaborations that NSF supports are sort of funded and set up, but I think that contributed to the success of this project.
Governor Blanchard, were there any particular challenges for the strategic fund? They weren't having to make routers work.
I think exactly. Jamie Kenworthy can probably talk about that, but I should mention that I think because our strategic fund had a board that had to approve grants, and $5 million was a lot of money in those days. I think it's still a lot of money, but in those days it was a lot of money, as Doug will confirm. I think it really helped because the board had my state treasurer and my commerce director, but the other 5 members were from the private sector. They were CEOs of businesses. It really helped that IBM and MCI were part of this. We might have been able to get the funding anyway because NSF had such a fine reputation, as do our universities anchored in Ann Arbor and Marriott. But the private sector participation gave it a validation, which I would not want to underestimate. And I think That's the only thing I want to say as I run to the plane. I'll give you a report tomorrow morning, Doug, on Carl Lemon. Thank you for having me, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. As we're, of course, not having sufficient time, I'll continue my questions, but hope we can have get succinct answers and be able to get to a couple more questions. Anne, would you like to comment on the MCI challenges?
Certainly. I think we echo much of what John had said earlier. Every day was new. We were in uncharted territories. There was no precedent for this activity, and I think that's a perspective and a place in time we can all look back at now, but when we were there in the moment, it was all new. I think also that we were quite often in a reactive mode with the necessity to react quickly because of the demands as opposed to being able to think and reflect and understand exactly why we did what we did. Dick used to refer to it sometimes, I think Jay Crookston has probably heard this as well. Jay is here today, but sometimes he'd come out of the executive committee meetings having committed a lot more and saying, well, we've got to feed the rat and think about it later. So on we went, and as there was also no way to forecast, that was another matter that clearly had to be considered and brought together. But I think in terms of benefits of the partnership, there was an immense commitment to this, corporate resource and financial resources and human resources, but a tremendous investment of passion of all of the people seated here and so many of the people in all of our organizations and in related organizations, and the passion that's brought over 200 people here. And I think if there was ever a benefit and a differentiator in that, it wasn't always smooth sailing, but everyone prevailed and persevered.
Steve, would you like to address the question of challenges?
Well, I have two challenges I think that I'd like to talk about. The first, rather lighthearted. There was a period between the award, when the award became public, and the backbone actually came up. When I had, if not daily, certainly weekly, times trying to talk to the community, the networking community. I mean, they came to me and said, you know, first you bring us fuzzballs, and now you do this thing with a room full of PCRTs. Quite apart from the fact that the design of the T1 routers was a very advanced design, and that in the end they worked very, very well. So that was a challenge. I think echoing what Doug said, the change in the business model when we went from T1 to T3, and trying to convince not only the foundation, but Congress and the public, the networking community, that there is something that you can purchase a service from a networking company, as opposed to what we had always done before, which was to lease lines, buy things. The notion of networking as a service was a brand new thing, and it was very hard to convince almost everybody that A, it was a good idea, and B, it was legal.
And Bob, would you speak to that too?
Yeah, actually, we had, I'm going to focus more on the original T1 proposal, because for us, that was probably the biggest challenge, although I do understand technically that and organizationally, the move to T3 was very significant. Internally, the challenges we had was to convince other parts of IBM and some of our senior executives that this was the right thing to do for us. You know, we had networking, which was not TCP/IP based, and we had a strategic, a publicly announced strategic commitment to OSI. Now, one of the things that helped was those as Dennis Jennings said today, there was these little insertions that said, and we support the migration to OSI when it gets defined, when somebody tells us what it is. So I did have a challenge in kind of going through a number of IBM executives to not so much convince them we had to do it because we were an independent business unit, but to essentially assuage their concerns and to remove any objections they had to it. So that, and part of that challenge was we did that over a very short period of time. We had essentially 6 weeks from the bid release to when actually the proposal was done. In that 6 weeks, we had to design and propose a system and an architecture that would meet both the defined needs and what we knew was going to be the growth. And that was part of that challenge, and at the same time, gain at least acquiescence, if not full support within the IBM executive community. And then there was a major challenge, which hasn't been mentioned, but there were, as you put it all together, there were almost 4,000 individual parts involved in deploying the initial T1 network. And just actually pulling that together and deploying it and getting everything installed and operating in the right in all of 13 locations was a major challenge. And took some actually very creative logistics work out of Walt Weeby's group to make that happen. You'll probably hear more about that later. But that initially, while not perhaps on the scale and scope of the T1, T3 transition, was a major logistical challenge.
And now I'd like to unfortunately ask a big question and just a brief comment as we're nearing the time for the end of the session, and that would be how you assess the impact of this project on your organization, on the community, whatever. I mean, how much of that, a big question for a short answer. So, Anne, would you like to start?
Sure. I think in terms of impact, clearly for MCI, this became a huge entree and experience and learning to forge their data strategy and going forward. Also, I think that clearly it was about much more than the network, but about enabling technology and enabling the accessibility of information, which has absolutely turned our world upside down and round today, and has impacted all of us. Thanks.
Steve?
What can I say? I'm from Cisco.
Doug?
You know, of course, it's impossible to follow that comment, but the fact is that, as the governor said a few moments ago, this turned out to be enormously important to the way that the state of Michigan, the University of Michigan, the universities in the state that are the members of Merit, how we thought about our capabilities, and how we, perhaps even more importantly, participated in this extraordinary revolution that took place as a result of the NSFNET effort. It's my own view that over the period from then until now, that this effort actually has turned out to yield, hundreds of millions of dollars of economic activity in the state of Michigan. And that $5 million investment, the strategic fund, was sure a good investment. And it's also the case that the University of Michigan and Merit both think of themselves quite differently as a result of having participated in this project.
John, I'm going to ask you to respond to this.
Two things. One is the impact on IBM as a whole was delayed, is probably the best way to say it. It was delayed because of the very large and very successful already existing business we had, but it has had a profound effect on IBM. And as we were discussing this morning, the commitment to open systems probably had a very large part of its origin, as far as IBM is concerned, in this project and in the flourishing of TCP/IP generally. Finally, I would say, put on my former National Science Board member hat and say that when it comes to infrastructure projects, of which the Foundation, of course, has supported a great many over the years and many kinds, this infrastructure project has probably had the most profound effect on society and on the world of anything that NSF has ever done in the infrastructure way.
I would second that. And I think if we reflect on the NSF funding, remember that the project started with $15 million for this piece for over 5 years. Our program budget the first year that I was there ended up in the $7.5 million bracket, even though it was supposed to have been higher. Of course, grew later. The investment payoff was enormous. But I want to thank the partners that have gathered here today, and the reason that we have this anniversary to celebrate, on behalf of the community, that you enable this to happen. I think that those of us here in this room, those of us who come from university backgrounds, corporate backgrounds, ordinary citizens, owe a major debt of gratitude to this group of organizations that participated in this. And on a personal note, I will say that managing this project was probably one of the easiest things that I had to do, because as a partnership, it seemed to work seamlessly. And I was part of the project meetings, and that's a very unusual situation to be in, where it is such a seamless activity. Everyone was focused on the goal. The goal, I think, was more than achieved. There were rough spots along the way, the technical ones that have been mentioned, but the ultimate outcome, I think we can all be very pleased with. Thank you very much. We'll see you this afternoon.